So, Phyllis, welcome. You've had such a fantastic response to your book, but no one visits the Centre for Optimism without first being asked, what makes you optimistic? What makes you feel optimistic?
I think it's hard to be somebody who works with children and not have them be the source of optimism. No matter what's going on in the world, you have these kids who are such works in progress, and that makes me so optimistic.
And tell us about your book, Middle School Superpowers. What was the genesis and how did you create this wonderful book?
So it was in many ways an outgrowth of my first book, Middle School Matters, which I didn't intend to write a sequel of sorts to Middle School Matters. But what happened is that in the school setting in particular, what I was noticing is that kids here in the United States were so different after the pandemic. And as I was zooming into other schools in other parts of the world, other parts of the country, they were seeing the exact same things. And what we were really staring at were these kids who were struggling to figure out what they needed to do to stay positive, to stay optimistic, to stay connected, to recover from disappointment, to bounce back when things that they thought would happen didn't happen, and to grieve for kids who lost relatives or who even lost experiences like summer camp that they wanted. And so this book in many ways is all about optimism. I know there's one chapter devoted to optimism, but it's really about helping kids when they're in the thick of it, stay hopeful, keep their sense of humor, see themselves as somebody who is a work in progress and nothing is going to defeat them. They're more capable than they think. And so it's 12 superpowers.
I love that reference to humor, and laughter. I was recently a keynote speaker at a conference of engineers. And the chairman of the meeting said, do you mind finishing with that laughter yoga you did at our place? And to see 168 out of 170 engineers laugh themselves silly and feel better for it, the notion of laughter and humor in the thick of it, I think you've really nailed something special.
Especially for kids at that middle school juncture, with that 10 to 14, 15-year-old age and stage, because everything is new. You are experiencing things for the first time. You don't have much perspective. You don't have a whole lot of life experience. And it's very hard to know that if you get dropped by a friend, or that if you don't do well on a quiz, or don't make a team, or don't get a part in the play, that doesn't mean there won't be other opportunities. That doesn't mean you won't make friends and find your people along the way.
Yeah, and for me as a person in their 60s, often teenage humor bewilders me. You've sometimes just got to laugh because they're trying to be funny.
Yes, and sometimes they try a little too hard and it can land mean, and sometimes it's just perfect. And as I write in the book, people in that age group, kids in that age group, use humor for so many different reasons, and they actually set an example for us as adults. They use it to distract themselves. They use it to make a point, to have some perspective. They use it to lighten the mood, to connect with people, to maybe not connect and find a way to avoid something that they don't want to deal with. But they use it in so many different ways. But the most common way they use it is to connect. And it could be as simple as sending a friend a really funny meme or a video, but they're doing that all day long. It's just such a big part of their DNA.
Yeah. Well, you see it when the Dalai Lama speaks. Even on the most serious topic, there's a bit of laughter every second or third sentence just to lighten the mood and to make us all feel good. Well, look, when I opened the book, you can imagine, Victor Perton from the Centre for Optimism opens chapter 12, and super optimism, the power to find hope and humor in the hard stuff. And you describe super optimism, which I had to add to my list of optimism superpowers, which is an exercise, we do. So tell us about, Phyllis's super optimism.
So I view optimism as an acquired skill. Some kids are born more capable of seeing the glass as half full, but a lot of kids actually need to be taught how to be optimistic. And we can really help them have a gentler school experience. We can help them bounce back from setbacks if we give them that set of skills. And it's a set of skills that involves really, really challenging skills, such as forgiving somebody. It's really hard, and there's that expression, a wounded animal always tries to bite. And in middle school, there's a lot of wounded animals because there's so much sensitivity and it feels like so much is at stake. And so we want to be teaching them skills like forgiveness, which is complicated. We want to be teaching them skills like challenging that negative self-talk. If they hear themselves saying something really self-critical, which middle schoolers can be super relentlessly self-critical, to take a step back and say, all right, well, yeah, that's something that I'm working on, but maybe there's some hidden strength in there. What might that be? And to shift their focus a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And what I like about that chapter is there's so much originality in it. You call to mind Martin Seligman and his work. Your work is quite original, and I just, love that notion, of, in some senses, there's almost a throwback to Victor Frankl's, Man's Search for Meaning, and his addendum, Tragic Optimism. Yeah, his notion, it doesn't matter whether you're in a concentration camp or living in modern America or Australia. There's so much to feel good about. And he says, just do your best.
I love that. And I do think it's the most philosophical chapter. It's probably the chapter where I veer the most off course and share personal anecdotes and share personal philosophies, including this mind-boggling concept that I'm still trying to embrace and really understand myself, that we have no way of knowing if getting what we want is a good thing or not. And we have the perspective as adults of looking back and saying, you know what, that job didn't work out, or that relationship didn't work out, and it was a blessing in disguise. But when you're a kid, you don't have any of that perspective. And it's hard enough to do that as an adult. So really helping kids understand and embrace that concept. I share a story actually about my own child in the book being upset that his braces didn't come off. And then it turned out that his braces were the only thing very shortly after that orthodontia appointment that kept his teeth from flying out of his mouth when he was hit by a baseball. So it's really true. We have no way of knowing if getting what we want is a good thing or not.
Yeah, my mother used to talk about contentment, rather than this pursuit of happiness, which is, of course, part of the American Constitution. And this year I've learned a lot about joy. We've had a partnership with an organization called the Art and Science of Joy out of Finland. And they chose our Center for Optimism to deliver the first superpower of joy, which is optimism. And so this year I've really been looking at moments of joy. And just yesterday I was out, I'm on the board of a water utility, and we were out having a look at Aboriginal, First Peoples facility. And one of the things our company is doing is putting in a modern sewage system, so that they can have tourists and visitors on. And it was just a moment of joy looking at our facilities in amongst the cows and the horses and nature. And so for me, this year's been a lot of learning and really focusing on that notion of capturing moments of joy. And one of the things a lot of parents do, Phyllis, is they'll ask the kids what's been the best thing in your day, or what was best at school or the like, but don't do it themselves. And the Dalai Lama, I was lucky enough to be in an audience with him last year. He said, look, you can't, optimism and hope are the most important things we can foster in children, but you can't tell them to be optimistic. You have to model it. And so I'm very focused on that modeling optimism, joy, and happiness for kids, rather than demanding they share what brings them joy and happiness.
I love that. And emotions are contagious. So if you're modeling that for your kids and you truly are embodying that attitude, they're likely to catch that as well. So I love that. And I love that approach. And I think another way that parents can ask their kids to think about things maybe with a little more nuance is, rather than to shut down whatever they've said is negative, to say, that sounds hard, just really validate what they said. And then ask them questions like, what did you learn from the experience? Or, reflecting on it now, is there something that good that came out of it, or something that you think you might not make that same mistake again? And helping them think about these things that they see as doom and gloom just a little bit more expansively.
And as an optimist, it's too easy to always, to drift into positive thinking. Whereas as an optimist, you're entitled to be angry. You're entitled to be frustrated. you can be entitled to be seeking change. So one of the things, there's been sort of difficult set of circumstances around one of my children, and she's been angry about something and surprised, and I just said, yeah, you're right. You're actually right, and then moving on onto the positivity. But oftentimes we parents want to immediately correct. And I think one of the things that it's taken me a long time to learn is just to say, yep, you're right.
And if we don't do that, and this is something that I quote a grief expert in the book saying, if you don't let kids express those feelings, they have all of these half-expressed emotions. And when the time comes that they really need to let it out, they no longer know how. If we're constantly squelching it, and as I tell kids, emotions are like a train going through a tunnel. The only way out is through. You have to experience them.
And look, I think I have a friend, John Hagel, who's on my board, and he wrote a magnificent book about 10 years ago called The Power of Pull. And he's written a more recent book called The Journey Beyond Fear. And curiosity and optimism are the keys. But I always say to him, I'd love to see a second edition of The Power of Pull. And I just, if you're thinking about another book, if I can say your chapter 12 is not just for tweens, it's for young adults, it's for old adults, it's for any age group, I think the wisdom. And I just love, top tips for parents. Come up with a mantra such as, I've got this, or there's always tomorrow, or I'll be okay. And about 18 months ago, a lady died in one of the Australian regional towns at the age of 107.
Wow.
And at the age of 106, she'd been interviewed on television, and they'd said, how have you lived so long? And she said, look, I'm an optimist. I never worry about yesterday because I can't change anything. And whatever I do today, the sun's still going to come up tomorrow. And I think your notion of there's always tomorrow, it's just wonderful for any age.
I think that's true. And a lot of the reason I write parenting books is because we need our kids, our students, to have someone modeling that you can handle hard stuff calmly and with some assurance that things will be okay on the other side. But they can't do that. They can't model it if they don't know how to do it themselves. And so I'm hoping that by incorporating all of these strategies in the book, that parents can teach kids that they can also use them and have a gentler experience in their own lives, because it's kind of hard to be a human. And no one is going to get out of this life without having some hardship and hard experiences, but we are going to suffer so much less if we can maintain that attitude that there is always tomorrow, and that we are strong and we can get through hard things.
About the news, I've recently had some correspondence with the Australian national broadcaster saying, I don't care whether they're biased left or right. The problem is they're biased towards negativity. And I'm sure you're aware of Rosling's book, Factfulness, that people, particularly tweens, their teachers got a lot of their world knowledge 10 years ago or 20 years ago when they went to university, and it's out of date. And the world is constantly progressing, it's getting better. But, when I was a kid, it was the big existential threat was nuclear war. We had Brezhnev and Nixon and, Lyndon Johnson, all with the, Kosygin, all with the red button. And there wasn't another existential threat. But today the kids have got climate change. And not we can do things, it's going to eat us up. And now we've got artificial intelligence. And Deepak Chopra had an article in a newspaper today saying it is a wonderful new technology. But, there's article after article about AI is going to eat your lunch and it's going to eat your job and the like. And then, of course, there is still the nuclear threat and, all of the stories now about, Fukushima and the like. So what are your strategies around tweens? Because they're constantly on their devices when they're not in class. If they're clever, they're on their social media while they are in class. And there's this constant reinforcement of the bad. So how do we deal with that? When so-called experts, so-called leaders are constantly talking about how bad things are, what are the best ways to say to kids, actually, particularly if they live in America or Australia, they live in close to paradise. What do we say to kids, when they, got this constant stream of negativity and that the world's getting worse?
Well, first, we want kids to be thinking about how ingesting all of that negativity is making them feel, and thinking about what they can do, maybe to change the algorithms on their social media feed, maybe to take breaks from certain apps, maybe not to scroll endlessly, maybe to make a point of not watching videos. Kids who are 11 or under can't handle the violence that they might be seeing here. It might be gun violence. And when they see it over and over on multiple channels, it can feel like it's happening multiple times, and it tricks their brain. And that is going to lead to a sense of not being safe. And we don't want our kids not to feel safe. There's research showing that while parents might think they're protecting their kids by reinforcing this idea that there's danger everywhere, the opposite is true. We can guard against, stranger danger or whatever it is we might be worried about without making them feel like the world is collapsing. And then talk to them about the stuff that they're seeing. So parents of tweens should be looking periodically at what they're seeing online so they can understand what information they're taking in and what images they're seeing. Because if a kid sees something they think they shouldn't see, or if it's too upsetting to make sense of it, they're not going to ask for help. But parents can proactively get in there, bring it up. Kids feel respected when parents are willing to have those conversations with them.
I think that's brilliant of you to, that particularly, can we coach them, to change the algorithm? Because when I read Twitter or I read Facebook or I read LinkedIn, because I'm constantly publishing optimism, the algorithms understand that I'm after positivity rather than negativity. We have a testing regime in Australia at year 3, 5, 7, and 9 called NAPLAN. And every year the newspapers cover it and say that the kids are worse at literacy, that they're worse at mathematics, and of course the Singaporeans and the Latvians and all those guys are getting better and we're getting worse. And I always think if only we tested them for their contemporary communication skills, Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok short videos, they'd get 100 and we'd all be failing. So I think one of the things we've got to do is sometimes reframe communication. So, I love talking on the phone. I love talking to you one-to-one. But, we see in tweens and teenagers, they send one-way voice messages and get back a one-way voice message. And, I say, well, why don't you just pick up the phone and talk? Oh, Dad, you just don't understand.
It's a culture shift, and there's some positive aspects of it. They're much more open than they used to be about anything. It could be about mental health. And I think they're finding a lot of sources of support for themselves online that are actually positive for them. And especially for kids who maybe don't have a peer group that they can connect with locally, that can help them feel like they have somebody to turn to. But there are other kids who use it as a shield, as a way to avoid those face-to-face interactions. And there are lots of kids who need a lot more social skills practice, and they're desperate to connect, and they want that face-to-face connection just like adults do, but we have to help them make it happen. And there's research showing that the more time kids are spending offline, especially in nature, the more optimistic and content they're going to be.
Yeah, no, you say that, encourage them to walk in nature for 10 minutes a day. And I remember reading a book. I was living in San Francisco at the turn of the last decade, around 2010. There was a book entitled The Last Child in Nature. And it just talked about the way in which regulations around where you can walk and, whether you can let your kid wander off, in my day, you're allowed to disappear for hours without anyone panicking that you'd been kidnapped.
Yes.
Today that's probably almost child abuse.
There's nobody just playing in the neighborhood where I am anymore. And it's sad to me that kids are not getting those opportunities to practice that freedom and that independence. I spoke to a reporter at the Star Tribune who wrote an article about how in Minneapolis, they were closing third spaces to teens, that they couldn't go to places like the mall or the movies without an adult because they were, troublemakers and getting in trouble. And she asked me what I thought. And I said, I think that's really awful, because we need to be allowing our kids to explore and have those coming of age opportunities where they can feel competent, which is such a huge part of kids having confidence. And they can't have that if they're never alone and they're constantly on a leash.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely brilliant. But again, we adults have got to lead on that. The Dalai Lama says, smile and say hello to everyone. And the other day I was walking from a meeting, and I had to walk about a kilometre down a main road. And I must have passed about 40 people. And not one of them looked me in the eye and said hello. I said hello to everyone. And 90% of them then looked up and smiled. And the evidence is that people do love to have strangers say hello, smile at them. But, here in Australia, where life is very safe, where gun crime is almost non-existent, knife crime is pretty much the same, that same lack of interaction with strangers on the street. So again, if we parents want to model to kids how to act, one of my favorite, bits of advice to people is smile and say hello to everyone.
So I will say, I love that you do that, in part because of something I see a lot more these days with the kids I see in private practice, the teens and tweens that I see in private practice. So many of them looking up, making eye contact, maybe in the hall at school, or saying hello is a massive social risk for them. They're too anxious to do that. It is maybe a 7 on a scale of 1 to 10. It's something that they have to work up to doing. And when I ask them what would make it easier, they always say, if the other person first looked at me and smiled. And so every time you do that, you're helping somebody else, maybe another adult who is afraid to say hi themselves.
Yeah, I was at a corporation recently, and people are walking down the corridors, looking at their phone or reading a paper. So it's not unique to teenagers.
Yeah.
There's this lack of interaction with strangers is very much an adult thing too these days. And Melbourne, where I live, it's a 5 million person city. It's an urban centre, and you do lose that. If you live in a small town and see the same people, they might drive you nuts. But on the other hand, there'll be lots of people And to live in an urban centre, so oftentimes, people see me walking up the street in a dark suit. I'm obviously not an axe murderer, but I'm talking to everyone I go past. So by the time they get to me, they're thinking, he's not nuts, but he must be interacting. So look, I could talk to you all day and for hours and hours. You are so charismatic. You are so energetic. And this book you have produced, it is just a gospel for these days. So Phyllis, deeply, deeply grateful to you. And if we at the Centre for Optimism can continue to support your work and your writing, that would be our great honour and privilege over the years to come.
Mine as well. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that conversation with Phyllis and Victor Perton. If you'd like to get involved and see more of our videos, share your optimism, increase your optimism, visit thecenterforoptimism.com. There's literally thousands of pages to assist you and lovely little tips and tricks for becoming more optimistic, encouraging super optimism and optimism for young people, as Phyllis recommended in this conversation today.